How I have approached this final paper is under the lines of how to write a publishable key term, publishable research slash seminar essay. I'm going to list 5 slides here, and the first 3 are sort of orienting slides, whereas the last 2 give you examples of how I'd write them. Primarily, I would assert to all of you, be relevant. Be relevant. Don't write on extraneous topics. Be relevant. Be relevant both to the class as well as to the conversation at large. And I'll post this, or I'll give it to Dr. Clayton to post this later, so you don't need to make notes per se. But secondarily, make sure it's apropos or appropriate, you could say. In so much as, do not write an essay that only tangentially covers the topics of the class. Make sure it's apropos. Thirdly, make sure it's poignant. This is a key thing. Fourthly, break new ground. I've always, even if you're wrong in what you assert, try to break new ground. Don't say the same old thing. And this, I think it was Brett, it's going to take you out of your comfort zone, because you're a historian, and you like to recapitulate the past or the movements of the past. But to make a publishable research and seminar paper, I contend we need to break new ground. Fifthly, and I think this is entirely critical, Dr. Clayton hit on this earlier, but be authoritative even if you're not. Be authoritative, indeed. My second set of suggestions would be that writing publishable research or seminar paper involves 4 main steps. Firstly, choosing a topic that both interests you and the audience, Dr. Clayton in this regard. Choose something that gets him spinning, that gets him excited. Secondly, collect relevant resources or information from scholarly sources. Don't quote Wikipedia or anything of that nature. Be scholarly in your orientation. Thirdly, make an outline that guides and structures your thinking. This is ever important, because oftentimes when we writers get to writing, we wander, we tarry, we go here and there, and we lose our path. But making an outline that guides and structures your thinking allows you to remain ever on target, ever on focus. And then fourthly, simply just write. Then delete, but make sure that you write. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And thirdly, I should say, my third slide here, writing a publishable research or seminar essay involves thoroughness. Consider at least a couple of sides of the issue, and thereafter articulate your position forcefully, but treat contrary arguments seriously and respectfully. Don't call Daniel Dennett, for example, if you have this view personally, don't call him a moron or anything of that nature. Be respectful. Treat your opponents, your contrary arguments, in a respectful manner. Don't totally just discount them because they're wrong. Treat them respectfully and responsibly. Secondly, read and cite primary sources most of all, if at all possible. Primary sources such as Dean Drummond's book, such as Dennett's text, etc. Try not to comment too much. You might bring them in for clarification, but try not to comment too much on what someone has written about what somebody else has said, or somebody else says rather. And then thirdly, take a clear position on the issue that you look to address, and then discuss it and resolve the relevant issue. That's key there. Resolve it in some fashion. Perhaps you get the wrong answer in the end, but you seek resolution of the problem nevertheless. Now moving on to my constructive suggestions. I've looked at Dr. Clayton's options for us for us to write this final essay. I've thought about it, and I've come up with 2 theses that I think are quite apropos. One, the relationship between religion and science rests upon a proper relationship between God and the world. That's your key thesis, or it could be your key thesis. Point 1 underneath that thesis: God and the world cannot be totally separate from each other. There must needs be a confluence between the two, which directly implicates panentheism, in my view. Thirdly, point 3, panentheism, for example, appropriately models the relationship between God and the world because it pictures the two as ultimately and completely and entirely and totally dependent upon each other, much like concentric circles are dependent upon one another. Point 4, God entirely and exhaustively interpenetrates the world, but at the same time is more than the world. God interpenetrates the world, and the world, you could say, even interpenetrates him in a sense, but God is more than the world at the same time. Point 5, God cannot be God without a world to be in relationship with. That's not proper English, but it makes perfect sense. Point 6, conversely, the world would not be the world, but would rather be mere chaos without a God to be in relationship with. I think this is a very fertile option. Something like this, as a result of this research seminar and so forth, would be publishable, for example, in numerous publications that would be offerable to you. For example, Zygon, maybe even Theology and Science, something like Wesleyan Theological Journal, etc., etc., etc. Now, my last slide here points to a thesis 2. And this thesis 2 is that the notion of divine action must be remodeled and reformulated to be kosher, or to be applicable, or to be, I mean, I'm adding up superlatives here, to be proper, you could say, in today's late modern, emphasis there, scientifically, somewhat scientifically cognizant world. And I've also delineated here several points that you could explore. Point 1, for example, old ways of looking at divine action are no longer tenable. We cannot do theology in the 21st century with the theology corpus of the 18th century or the 19th century. Point 2, there must needs be a reformulation of divine action for it to remain palatable in today's world, in today's late modern world. Point 3, panentheism, which sort of approaches the previous, but not exactly. Panentheism, because it pictures God and the world as ultimately and entirely and totally dependent upon the other, appropriately models the relations between God and the world. Building from that, notice here how each of my points build on each other. They're not disparate, they build upon each other. Point 4, God entirely and exhaustively interpenetrates the world. I think I've already covered that pretty clearly. Point 5, because God totally and entirely and completely and utterly interpenetrates the world and is necessarily a future reality, God then could indeed beckon, behoove, or bid, or draw nigh to him, so to speak, him, at the world toward the eschaton. Point 6, God then lures the world toward himself. Now, I'm going to qualify this in so much as God's greatest goal for the world is not the generation of human beings per se. It's not the generation of a of just a mentality that could interact with him, but rather is the generation of complexity in its varied and multifarious forms and the extension of diversity. This is because simply in point 8, God lavishes, he exalts, he rejoices in the generation of diversity and complexity in and of themselves. Point 9, this diversity and complexity please God because God desires the multiplicity of forms, as is modeled, for example, in the awesome fecundity of different I guess you could say different forms of humanity. Indeed, human beings in all their complexity, their multiplicity. So then I've given you some general outlines here regarding a publishable research seminar paper, and I've also given you 2 concrete examples that I think would appropriately encompass what Dr. Clayton desires for this course. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradford. Very nicely done. That's a very helpful guideline to students as they begin to prepare their final papers.